you want to just make that panel reduce, and then once you've got that reduced, then you're set. If you want to open it back up, you can type in the questions in that little question box right there, and then that way you can see all of those questions right there, and we'll handle those as we get to them. And I can take them as many as I can. I'm going to leave time for the end for questions. So some I'll get to and some I won't, but I hope I'll get to as many as I can. All right. Without any more introductions or housekeeping, let's move forward here. So let's talk about the 7 steps to power training. So that's what we're going to talk about tonight. We're going to go through these. Step 1, testing. Step 2, training zones. Step 3, diagnosing strengths and limiters. Step 4, building your power profile. Then we'll go into what we call the performing stage, where we now do step 5, we build a periodized plan. Step 6, we build power workouts. Step 7, we track fitness, and hopefully that leads to the win or success at whatever goal you have. And that's what we're going to go over tonight. So when we first talk about step 1, we have to do some testing. So the first thing that we always test is we test your functional threshold power. All right, and this is the highest average power that you can hold or sustain for about an hour. And typically, for most of us out there, if we can do a 40-kilometer time trial, that's a great test for us, and that's one way that we test it. Another way is, if you don't want to always do a 40-kilometer time trial, an hour time trial, we can reduce that test and do a 20-minute test and take 95% of that. That's very close to what your hour power should be. Now, it's not always going to be perfect. Some of you might be, that's 5% off. Some of you may be 7. Some of you may even be 10. But some of the other ones may be 1 or 2. So it's a good general guideline to go by. So if you do a 20-minute, take 5% off of that. That should be about what you can do for an hour. Now, you can also take what we call the normalized power. And the normalized power is ultimately the power that you would do if you pedaled smoothly for the entire effort. And we have this metric that we use in our software. And that's something that you can see on your PowerTap Joule screen as well. So if you use an hour of the normalized power from a hard race, your best hour, that might also be a really great way to measure your functional threshold power. The key here is you have to test frequently. Okay, so every 6 weeks is really the way we want to do this. We want to test every 6 weeks. We want to make sure that you do that enough. So functional threshold power, it's really the most important physiological determinant of performance in events. And since this is an aerobic sport, it really is all the way down to, an effort that's 3 or 4 minutes long, all the way out to the Tour de France, a really long effort. So having that fitness, that's what, the higher your FTP, the higher your fitness is. That's really key. Once we've done some testing, we're going to establish zones. Okay, so these are the Coggan training levels, and this is a great graph here in order to help us understand what training zones are about. And Dr. Coggan did a great job in looking at the name and purpose of each one in terms of what does it actually do physiologically, what energy system are you improving or working. How does that relate to your threshold power, and how does that relate to a threshold heart rate, not your max heart rate, but your threshold heart rate, your rate of perceived exertion, and then the time that is related to these things. So for most of us, we're in active recovery most of our lives, 70 to 80 years. We can spend at less than 55% of threshold power. So that relates to, a very low heart rate. That relates to a very low perceived exertion as well. And this perceived exertion is on a scale of 1 to 10. Now, when we get to endurance, level 2, we increase our intensity 56 to 75%. Then we have our rate of perceived exertion 2 to 3. And this could be as short as a 2.5-hour rod, as long as an event that could last up to 14 days. So for most of us, we probably need to go longer than 2.5 hours, maybe 3.5, 4 hours in order to improve our endurance. But if you've never ridden more than an hour, then a 2.5-hour ride is going to work on your endurance. So keep that in mind. I wouldn't recommend doing a 14-day race in order to improve your endurance, but ultimately, all these crazy people who do Race Across America and eco challenges and everything, they can do this pace for up to 14 days. So it's a huge, huge effort, massive effort. Now, when we get to the next level up, level 3, tempo, now this is 76 to 90% of FTP. We're getting more intense. This is as short as 2.5 hours, and you can even break this into blocks like 40 minutes or 45 minutes or so, 60 minutes blocks of tempo pace. It takes focus. It takes effort. When you do a 2.5-hour tempo ride, it is like you come home and you're like, wow, that was hard. Your back is sore, you're tired, you had to focus, you had to breathe pretty hard for most of the time. It really is a pretty big deal. So that's something that you consider. Now, elite athletes, I've seen elites that have been able to do up to 8 hours. So that might be something that, if you get to do very, very longer races, you might be in that pace for a long time. When we get to this lactate threshold, this is level 4. This is your 100%, all right? So this is what you can do for an hour. Your 100% is. This is, by definition, 60 minutes. But we can train our lactate threshold, train the lactate system, as little efforts, as short as efforts as 10 minutes, okay? We do those 10-minute efforts, and we need to do them around 105% of our threshold power. Okay? So then you have to be over a threshold a little bit. The 10-minute time period is long enough to create enough stress on the body so that it makes you adapt and get stronger from that. Okay? So that's a key relationship here, is this time and intensity relationship. That's a key thing we're looking at. Because when we get to VO2 max, now we're doing 106 to 120%, and we're doing intervals between 3 and 8 minutes. Okay? So at 120%, you're probably doing 3 minutes, okay? And at 8 minutes, you're probably doing about 106 or so. And that's really the trick, right? So if you go out and you're doing 4-minute intervals at 100%, but you're trying to improve your lactate threshold, then you're not going long enough, right? Because a 4-minute effort isn't long enough to really give you enough stress to improve your lactate threshold. But at the same time, a 4-minute effort at 100%, that's not hard enough to improve your VO2 max. So you're really kind of in, no man's land. It's kind of a gray zone there. So if you want to improve these systems, we got to relate this time component to the intensity component. We get to anaerobic capacity, well, 30 seconds to 2 minutes. This doesn't really apply to heart rate because the effort is pretty much over before your heart rate has a chance to really respond and get up to that level. You'll probably see your peak heart rate as well. That goes to its peak after the interval's over. We get to neuromuscular power. This is a maximal effort, 5 to 15 seconds. Okay, so that's the key here. Is a maximal effort, 5 to 15 seconds. And that's really what you're looking for, is you're trying to find that. It doesn't really relate at all to this lactate threshold, but it is a maximal effort. You can have a track sprinter on the velodrome. One of the best sprinters in the world might do 2,400 watts, but their threshold may be 150 watts or 200 watts or something. Or you may have a road sprinter like, let's say, Mark Cavendish, that's 1,800 watts, but his threshold's relatively high. He has to be at 350 watts at least just to get over the mountains in the peloton. So it doesn't really relate to threshold, but we just need to know that in order to improve our neuromuscular power, you do maximal efforts 5 to 15 seconds. All right, so once we've done step 1, testing, step 2, we put that into training zones. We figure those out. We do step 3, we do what's called the power profile. So this is a more complete testing of all the other physiological zones. Okay, so really, this is a little more testing, so it's related to step 1, and it's finding your strengths and limiters, or strengths and weaknesses. We have to test your sprint, so we've got to do a 5-second sprint. Now I would recommend a 10 or 15-second sprint just in order to get that sprint really through, but we take the best 5 seconds. And we also do a 1-minute effort. I like doing these on a hill so that you can get a little bit higher wattage on those. We do a 5-minute effort. I also like to do these on a hill. If you have a hill as long as 5 minutes, that's great. Get a little bit higher wattage there. And then that tests your VO2 max. And this is what we build. We build this power profile chart, and this is the chart that's inside of our Training Peaks WKO software, where this is our 5-second power, our 1-minute power, our 5-minute power, and this is our functional threshold power right here. Now, this, you notice there is the big thing that we're looking for here is we're looking for the shape of your power profile curve. So if you are upward sloping to the right, you're going to be more of a time trialist, a stage racer, a hill climber, a steady state rider. Now, if you go the other way, what if you're downward sloping from the left, all right, and you're going this way, then you're going to be more of a sprinter. You've got a lot of anaerobic capacity, but not quite so much aerobically. So that's going to be the difference here. So we're looking at this because this is the strengths and weaknesses. Here you can see this athlete doesn't have a great sprint, doesn't have a lot of anaerobic ability, but can just go out there and drill it and hold that 5-minute and 20-minute power or 60-minute power for a much longer, for a longer period of time and not fatigue. Okay, so that's a key thing to keep in mind, because that is going to give us some focus when we get to actually building our workouts. Now, this is something that we do in our coaching group. We have a little spreadsheet that we play with, and again, you can see here this is a sprinter. So this athlete, Joe athlete here, has a great sprint, Cat 1, very good 1 minute and good 5-minute and FTP. So this is just another example here of how we build this. And we've got a little spreadsheet that we do and play with, and it kind of gives you that. So if you don't have our software, just let us know, and we'll send you a copy of that spreadsheet. Super easy to play with and put your numbers in there. All right, so now step 4. All right, so once you have created your essentially your zones, your FTP, and your strengths and weaknesses, then what we have to do is we have to understand the demands of the event. Okay, so what are the demands of the event first? Okay, because if you're doing a hill climb time trial and you live in a flat area like Florida, it's going to be a challenge, to get the right type of training in order to excel in that kind of an event. Or possibly, let's say you're doing a dead flat, 100-mile Gran Fondo, and you live in a very mountainous area. So that could be very different from you in terms of how you train for that event as well. So this is the first thing we do. We have to understand the demands of the event and what does that mean to us. Okay, so for this other example, you're in time trialing. You have to have the ability to maintain a high steady state power. All right, so high threshold power, high functional threshold power. Whereas like a criterium, you're on off, you're on off, on off, on off, on off, on off, on off the whole time. All right, and so that is a very different type of effort that you're going to need to do and train for. So when we get to the training type workouts, we'll do that. Once we've done that, then what we have to do is we have to really understand the characteristics of you, right, the ability of you, the cyclists, in relationship to the demand of the event, okay? So that's what we use that power profile for, is we have to understand what are your abilities, and then we have to understand the demands of the event, and now we understand the relationship between those two. And then we now have to figure out, well, how do we best prepare you for that effort? So that's a key thing here, is to understand that and how we bring all this together. And this is one of my favorite slides. I love this slide. It gives us a real clear understanding of this relationship. First, we have, again, the general demands of the event. Okay, these are external really. And then we have the specific demands of the event. So again, let's take the general demands of the event. Let's say, for example, you're going to do a, let's say for a 60-kilometer race, and it's 6 laps of a 10-kilometer circuit. And on each circuit, you have 2 hills, and each hill is a kilometer long. So you know, okay, well, if we've got 2 hills, each are a kilometer long, we're doing 6 laps. That means I'm going to have to do 12 1-kilometer hill repeats. Okay, our general demands of that event are it's 60 kilometers. Okay, we have to do 12 hill climbs. Our specific demands of that event are, okay, well, how hard are those hills? How steep is the hill itself? Do we hit that at 30 miles an hour and we roll up half of it before we actually have to do it? Or do we hit it from a slow speed? Is it steep? Is it relatively flat? And then how far apart are the hills between each other? So you have to kind of understand the specific sides of that. Is there wind involved in this course? So we're always looking at those specific things that can really make a difference for us. The next thing here we've got is we have the internal side. Okay, so we have to always consider the psychological focus and your motivation. All right, so what are your goals really? Okay, what are you trying to achieve in this event? How are you making that happen? So that's something that you always have to think about and consider anytime you're doing something like this. Okay, so that's a key thing. What's your self-talk like? And what that's going to, and what is, it's more like, why are you doing it? Okay, you have to understand your why. I'm really big on this with all the athletes that I coach. I really try and get down to the why. When I get to the why, then I really understand the athlete and their motivations. The next thing is we have that internal side is what are your strengths and limiters? What are your strengths and weaknesses? What can you do well? And then how do we relate that, again, back to the characteristics and demands of the event? Okay, so it's a great way to think about this. Once we've gotten those things dialed in, now we're ready to start building a periodized training plan. Okay, so why do we do this? Well, responses to training are complex and difficult to predict. You know, peak performance readiness is not necessarily stable and tends to change. I like to think of it as it's like boiling water, and water is getting hotter and hotter and hotter and starting to bubble a little bit, and then it starts to boil just a little bit, and then it gets really rolling boil, and then it starts to you start to turn off the heat, and the boiling slowly goes away, and the water cools down all the way till it's back to room temperature. Similar, in terms of your fitness, you're going to have to manage how much heat you put into the water to bring the water to a boil when you want it to a boil. And we do that by figuring out we have to break our program down into smaller, more manageable cycles to allow for this kind of progressive build-up. How is this water going to heat up and boil? And we want to do it right, just at the right time. And again, when you do this, when you create this comprehensiveness, when you create this overall plan, it really allows for higher peak. I know lots of athletes who just kind of, are haphazard in their training and they're droning along and they're just kind of doing the same thing over and over. And they haven't really, they get fitter sometimes, but they generally just kind of stay fit all the time. There's nothing wrong with that. But at the same time, if you really want to do well in one thing, then it is something that you really push, to have a plan for. Okay? So, next one we're going to look at then, when we think about this, is, again, just a little bit more talking about periodization. It really is the biggest bang for your buck. It is absolutely breaking these goals down into the smaller, measurable milestones. And it's, again, to me, the holy grail of coaching is it's not just getting an athlete fit. I mean, that's relatively simple. I can get any athlete fit, give them a training plan specific and customized to their needs, and they're going to get fitter. They do at least 80% of that. It would be better if they did 90% of it. But at the same time, the holy grail of coaching is having them peak on the event at the time and the effort that they want to. So that is a big deal. All right. Now, next thing we're going to look at is how does this work? How do we make this happen? Well, first off, let's look at the classic periodization cycles. Tudor Bompa, he came up with this back in 1968. He originally wrote this for weightlifting, and super neat guy. I got to meet him. Oh, it's been probably almost, well, not quite 10 years ago, probably 7 or 8 years ago, and we both spoke at a triathlon conference. And a really neat guy. I got to sit down and spend some time with him and talk to him about how he came up with this idea. And it really was this need and desire that he wanted to have, was to create this peak of fitness at a certain period of time. And he called it, the training phases. We have macro and micro cycles. And this is the preparatory phase, and this is the competitive phase, and then we have this transition phase. And so in each one of these things, we have the macro cycles, the 3 builds, so to speak, and then we have the 3 2 competitive ones, and then transition back. And you build those down in different weeks. Well, we do a similar thing. We don't change that too much. We just kind of define it a little bit more in terms of cycling. And what we do is we like to say, well, in this build and base period, we work on these things. We work on endurance, we work on a functional threshold power, and then we work on what we call force, or we're trying to actually create a little more strength on the bicycle. Right? How do we do that after we build those 2 things? And then we go into what we call our specialization phases, where we're working on our limiters and then our sublimiters. So in the previous slide there, the power profile, the limiter of this guy was clearly sprinting. All right, a sublimiter would be probably anaerobic capacity. So those 2 things we need to work on in balance for him. And we have to, again, look at that back towards the demands of the event. Let's say, for example, that athlete was doing a time trial. Okay, they don't really need to train their sprint or anaerobic ability in this specialization phase. But what we might do is we might start working some of their shorter efforts in order to enhance their time trial. So maybe we might do 2-minute, 3-minute, 4-minute kind of efforts that are very intense, but also more aerobic. Then we come into this peaking phase where we go and race. So once we've built the training plan, once you've gotten that built, then we've got to assign workouts. Okay, so the beauty of training with a power meter is the fact that the workout is designed by your training zones, and then it's expressed by wattage. So the targets, the wattage targets become kind of the carrot that you're going after, and sometimes it's the stick that hits you from behind to keep you going. All right, so it can be both a positive and negative motivator. So we like the carrot side. Sometimes, though, you need the stick. We measure our workout success by the numbers, which, again, that gives us clear, in terms of clear, defined goals, and it also gives us clearly defined when we have succeeded and we have failed, so we know how we're doing overall. And it also helps us to understand when we need to stop. Right? When should you stop doing workouts? When should you stop doing intervals? All those things. So we have to have those things in here. All right, and that way it gives us some ideas in here. So let's look at some sample workouts in here and how we might work with these. And first off, we're going to target the correct system. Okay, so here in this example, we're looking at the endurance. All right, so we're trying to improve this rider's endurance, and that gives them the wattages. All right, for each one. Okay, so we have different targets. So in this side here, we're doing a little tempo work, 258 watts to 308 watts. All right, and the other thing that it gives us here is when we have this, we have a clear communication system. This is very obvious what my prescription is, what I need to do. I'm going to go out and I'm going to do this workout. I'm going to come back. I've done it. I've succeeded. Did I match my goals that I wanted to do it? So that's a little bit about just how that works. Let's talk about a few different workouts and how I use these in terms of training with Power Meter. So when we're thinking about these, let's think about this as this our athlete here is 285 watts, and what we're going to first do when we go out on active recovery is we're going to use our power meter, our power tap power meter, for a governor. All right, it's a ceiling, and you're going to ride at just it below 153 watts. All right, so that's a key thing there that you have to consider is you're using that, as a governor. All right, and that's what you want to do. Too many people ride way too hard in their active recovery days. It is absolutely, something that, it just happens, right? We get fit and you feel like you can just go for it. But, this is a perfect place to use your power tap because you can just limit that, right? Go out. Okay, I got to go under 150 watts. Right? That's embarrassingly slow for a lot of us, okay? But it makes you really recover, okay? So when you come back, you download your power meter. Now, if you had to go 400 watts to get out of the way of a truck or something or go up a hill, then, you had to do 400 watts. Right? You didn't blow your active recovery necessarily with one effort. Now, if you picked a ride that's very hilly and you're doing 400 watts all over and over and over, then, that's going to be a problem. That's just not a good place to do your active recovery. Okay? So keep that in mind. All right. Here's another one. This is another example that is a great way to use your power meter. And in this one here, we're doing what we call sweet spot. So this is just underneath your threshold power. And this is great because in this one, we've got a warm-up. So we've got our warm-up targets, how we're going to do our warm-up, what are the things we need to do there. All right. Then we've got our interval targets. Okay, so now you're going to ride between 89 and 92% of FTP. That's a key thing there. And then, the next thing we're going to do is we're going to look at maybe our special targets. Okay, so in this case, this is one of my favorite ones where you do sweet spot and you go over and under your threshold. Okay, so in this one, you're riding at 2x20. Just under your threshold, 89 and 92%, 250 to 263. And then every 2 minutes, you pop it right up to 120% of your FTP, 340, 342, something in that range. Just boom, just hold it there for 30 seconds as best you can. Then recover back to that same previous one, 250 to 263, 89 and 92. This is a great, excellent workout because what it does is it's filling up the bathtub 3/4 full, and then every 2 minutes you fire hose the bathtub, and the water goes right up to the edge and almost flows over into the floor. But then right before it flows onto the floor, you turn off the fire hose and it drains back down 3/4 full, and then you fire hose it again. All right, it's a great way to create plenty of stress in order to improve and get your threshold power up. We also have cool down targets here. What are we going to do for cooling down? How we make that happen. So that's something that you're going to have. You're going to have, okay, there's your ceiling, there's your governor, you've got it. So keep that in mind. All right, race winning, VO2 max. All right, so here we have our warm-up targets. Again, I really like this one. This is another one that I came up with for a long over the years, just because I saw this happening over and over and over and over and over again in terms of when somebody won a race. Think about how you win a race, right? And especially like a road race, you're in a peloton, and then you attack, and so you have to create a gap, right? You create separation, and then once you get separation, you have to maintain separation, if not grow separation, grow that gap. Okay. A lot of times what will happen is you get that gap, and then a group, a couple of guys will come up to you, and then boom, you're on now in the breakaway, and you're just got to jump on their wheel and you go, okay? Or possibly the Peloton's breathing down your neck and you did this in the last 4 or 5 miles or 4 or 5 minutes of the race, and then you have to sprint out of the saddle towards the end. So in this case, what we're going to do is we're going to do 5 race-winning intervals. Each one ends up being about 3 minutes and 40 seconds. Each interval starts with a 30-second sprint, where 15 seconds you're out of the saddle. All right, and that is a solid sprint, but not a crazy sprint, because you don't want to blow up off the front, right? And then you're going to, try and average 200% of your threshold power in those first 30 seconds. So in this case, about 570 watts or so. A peak of 300 if you can do it, 300%. So in this case, around 850 watts. Then you're going to ride for 3 minutes, right around 100 to 110% of your threshold power, right in your VO2 max zone, all right? And then you're going to finish with an out-of-the-saddle 10-second burst, and right at the end of that 3-minute effort, okay? So that's where you're going to simulate a Peloton, a breakaway catching you, or maybe the Peloton catching you, and you say, that's a big part of it, all right? So you've got that, and that's 3 minutes and 40 seconds. All right, so that's a great way to simulate this exact race-winning effort. And I tell you, I've seen this over and over and over and over to hundreds of files of people who win bicycle races. This is what it takes to win, right there. All right, so those are a couple specific workouts that you might use your Power Tap with in order to train specific systems. There's plenty more. In the back of the book, Training Racing with a Power Meter, the second edition that Dr. Coggin and I wrote, we've got a whole workout guide there where I believe there's like 60 different workouts that you can use and play with, and they're all based on the different training levels or training zones. Those are great ones. Okay. So now let's talk about in terms of step 7. So now what do we do, right? So now we've done all these different steps. We've learned our threshold power. We have learned our training zones. We have determined our strengths and weaknesses. We have created our periodized plan. We've done workouts. And now we're ready to start tracking your training, okay? And this is a chart that we use, and we'll go more in depth in the next webinar about the Performance Manager chart and some of the more advanced concepts. But ultimately what we're looking at here is we're looking at what we call chronic training load, this dark blue, right? And the pink is what we call acute training load. So chronic training load is everything you do over the last 6 weeks. Acute training load is everything you do every week, okay? And then this yellow here, this is what we call training stress balance. If you notice here on this y-axis TSB, training stress balance, we have positive numbers and then we have negative numbers right here. So anytime the training stress balance is down here, then we're more fatigued. Anytime our training stress balance is up here in a positive number, we are fresher, okay? Now, what we're trying to do here is you can see how we ramp up the chronic training load, and we are doing that, and we have little rest periods. These little dots here indicate some bests. So the black one is our 20-minute best for average power, and the orange ones are our 60-minute best for normalized power. And you notice this build period here comes up, the athlete rests, gets a little positive, and then you see these peaks, okay? So that's what you're looking for, is we're correlating the training dose with the response, okay? So that's where we're starting to figure out how we peak for different events, okay? So that's a key thing here. So this is 1 year right here, and then we have the next year. You can see this is the off season right here, where this athlete took off the season and recharged their battery, so to speak, and gained a lot of freshness. Didn't lose a ton of fitness, came back up though, built right back up, and then again had some rests and had some peaks. So you can see building up, and then he just stabilizes right here, and then boom, 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 peak efforts, and then goes into some more freshness here, peak, 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 build fitness, right after that, peak, peak, all the way through. So you can really see how these types of things correlate with each other. So let me show you an example or a couple of examples of athletes that I'm working with. And this is an athlete that has been building over years, and I've been working with him for about 5 years now. And he's now a senior in college, so he's really been developing himself over time. And you can see that he came into 2002 here, where his chronic training load was relatively low, down at 57, and then it built up all the way into May, where it peaked here in May, around 100, and you can see where he had some different peak efforts here. So there's his best 5 minutes. I also look at his best 1 minute, and then there is his best, let's see if I can hover over that one there, best 20 minute. So you can see where he took some rest, rebuild here, went to the off season here, this is off season, and then came back even stronger, and then had a little bit of a break right here, and then rebuild, rebuild, rebuild. And so now he's way up here, is at the highest that he's been for a while. He's had some very good peaks, and let's kind of zoom in on this a little bit, and you can kind of see his chronic training load coming up, and you can just see all of his peaks right in here, 5 minutes and 20 minutes happening right through in here. He's doing really, really well, riding well. And notice on this, his training stress balance was positive 17, and he had both a 20-minute and a 5-minute on that day. Whoop. Let's go. Where did I go? Sorry about that. Here we go. And then we had both a 5-minute and a 20-minute on that day. So that's what we're looking for right there. All right, so that's something that you can consider because that's a key thing that we're looking at is we're looking at our 5 minutes, which is VO2 max. I like to look at it, especially for this athlete. There are different ones that I look at for each different athlete. I also look at his 1 minute because that's his anaerobic ability. I want to see when that's the highest. And I like to look at his 20-minute too. I look at his 60-minute, but not quite as much because he does a lot more 20-minute efforts, so that's a better gauge for him of his fitness and how he's improving. So just keeping that in mind with all that. So there we go. Let's look at another guy. Here is another athlete here. This is somebody who has been very, very consistent over the year. You can see that starting here, and this is around August or so, 2012, came up and has been very stable and consistent, building up. This is a professional rider in Brazil, all the way up to 160 TSS per day in August after he did a bunch of stage racing in Europe, and then had a break, and then had one more rebuild, had another stage race, came back to Brazil, then kind of basically took his off season, and then came back and started rebuilding here. And so had a stage race in December that he did, and then went and did Tour San Luis and a couple other things. And right now, his fitness is coming down a little bit, but that's because we had a big peak of fitness right here. You can see that he did some pretty big numbers in this time period right here. And he really peaked in the beginning of the season. So he had the Tour of Brazil that he did, the Tour of San Luis. He had some big races that he had to do well in, that he wanted to do well in. And so he peaked here. So now we're recovering him and then getting him ready for his next peak, which will be a little bit later in the season. So that's where we are with him. We can zoom in a little bit on here, and you can see a little bit of that in terms of here's the Tour of Brazil, where he peaked again, 172 TSS per day, which is a lot of chronic training load, let me tell you. Then you can see how his fitness did well here in some of these races afterwards, as he was doing other races after the Tour of Brazil. All right. So it gives us a good idea of, in terms of the bigger picture of how we track those fitness changes, how we track your periodization cycle, and then how we're doing it from that perspective. So just keep that in mind as we're doing it. we're going to go way more in depth in the next webinar at the end of the month on this, so keep that in mind from that perspective, and we'll have you all dialed in from there. So why don't we go through some questions now, and I will do my best here to answer as many as I can and see what we can come up with. So let's see what we got here. All right. And if you have questions right now, now is the time to ask them. All right. Let's see what we got here. Is that the modified Borg scale? Yes, that was the 0 to 10 scale. You take 95% of your average 20-minute test heart rate as well in order to set your threshold heart rate. Good question. I think that ultimately the threshold heart rate, the best way to do that is to take the last 10 minutes of your 20-minute test, and whatever the average heart rate for the last 10 minutes is generally your threshold heart rate. So I would recommend doing that. I think that's much better than taking 95% of the heart rate you use in the test, because what happens is at the beginning of the test, your heart rate's relatively low, and so that would probably just keep it low, and I would underestimate what's going on there. All right, good question though, great question. All right, let's see here. Yes, the slides will be available for download afterwards. Let's see what else we have. At what point in the cycle do you start incorporating sweet spot training? Great question, and that's something that you know you have to consider from a goal perspective. Okay, so let's go back a little bit here and look at the slides for a second. And you know, our sweet spot is right in here. It's just right in this range in between tempo and threshold, and that's really what we're looking for in that area. The periodization part of this comes into, and we'll come down here to our periodization slides. It can come in this phase in here. I like to at least have a solid, what I call foundation of fitness before we start to do a lot of sweet spot training. So to me, let's say, for example, a typical season. So you go through the season, you take October off, now you start November. November becomes your new beginning of the next year. You can maybe do some cross training and just kind of riding your bike, getting fitter. You know, December becomes, you know, the next 4 weeks of training. And that's when you start to do more tempo work, a little bit of sweet spot work in that period, and then in January you're really starting to do some. So I like to have at least 6 weeks of endurance type training first before I do sweet spot work, and it doesn't have to be directly in that sweet spot range and that endurance range. I mean, you can have a bit of tempo, a bit of sweet spot, a bit of threshold in there, all those things in that time period. But when you start to focus, you know, and start to do the 2x20s and do the 30 or 40-minute efforts at sweet spot, that's when I need, you know, you need to have at least 6 weeks, 8 weeks of decent fitness in there. So that should be it. All right, so I would incorporate that. And, you know, I do also, when I do that, then I want to have about 6 weeks of sweet spot training before I move on to true threshold training. Okay, so if you've been doing sweet spot training from, let's say, February and March, then bang, you're ready to do threshold training now. Okay, so that's something that, you know, that's a big deal. All right. Now, when I ride into the wind, my power doesn't seem to correlate with rate of perceived exertion. It feels a lot harder than the numbers indicate. Yeah, good question there. You know, I tell you, the wind can be brutal. It absolutely can be brutal, and it is a challenge. The watts are the watts. Okay, so when you're doing 250 watts going into the wind, and you're doing 250 watts in a tailwind, it's the same amount of work. Okay, so you're not doing any more or less work from that perspective. That's the beautiful thing about having a power meter, is it's the truthometer, and it is what it is. So ultimately, when you're into the wind, you kind of have to hunker down, so to speak, and recruit a little more muscles than you might do when you're in a tailwind and you're just flying along, spinning a fast gear, and you're not using those same muscles in order to go forward at the same 250 watts. So the perceived exertion can be different just from the fact that, it's like, golly, I'm only going 12 miles an hour here, but I'm doing 250 watts, versus if I turn around, I'm going to be going 32 miles an hour, and I'll be doing 250 watts the same way. That's just kind of that psychological aspect of it is a challenge sometimes. But that's the beautiful thing about having a power meter. Just look at your power meter. Know if you're doing it, you're doing 250 watts, you're doing 300 watts, whatever it is, in the wind, it's the same thing as if there was no wind or in a tailwind. So that's it. All right. Now, should lactate threshold testing be done every 6 weeks in a lab setting or a road setting? Great question. I would like for them to be done on the road if possible. I know we just came out of winter in most areas in the United States, so a lot of us are all getting on the road and doing our testing now. Some of you are still on the trainer, sorry, and therefore you probably should continue doing your testing indoors. So what I do is when my athletes start to ride indoors, typically in December, then I test them indoors. So, boom, I need to test them, around the 15th of December, test them indoors. We build their training zones around that indoors, and then after that, we go from there. And we use those training zones and that threshold indoors until we start going outside on a regular basis. So, for example, most of my athletes start coming outside around March 15th or so. We have to test again. We test again outside. Now we use these zones for outside, because indoor and outdoor numbers can be different. They can be different by as much as 30 watts, and it's not because the measuring principle is different or anything like that changing. There's a bunch of engineering type things that are going on where on the bicycle outside you've got a lot more inertia, and therefore you don't have a lot of resistance when you pedal around the bottom or top of the pedal stroke. But on a indoor trainer, you always have resistance around the entire pedal stroke, and so that's an issue that changes the effort. You also have the fact that you are, indoors. You could overheat as well, and then depending on the trainer itself, and depending on how much weight you have from a flywheel perspective, that can also be something that doesn't give you that same realistic road feel. So keep that in mind. It can be 20 to 30 watts off. If you spend a lot of time riding on the indoor trainer, you're going to become very trained to that, and you're going to probably do the same that you would do afterwards. All right. In one of your workout examples, Sweet Spot, you had your athlete working in no man's land. I thought you said avoid working in that area. Okay, so think about no man's land in let me show you our training zones again here. Think about this in terms of time and intensity. Okay, so here, we're in between zones, but we need to make sure that we're doing that for a relatively long time. Okay, so for Sweet Spot, we can break this down into a minimum of, say, 30 to 45 minutes. Like, I don't do much less than 30 minutes sweet spot in order to really feel like I'm getting any kind of true training stress to improve from. So you need to spend at least 30 minutes at sweet spot in order to get that training stress. Now, if you only spent 10 minutes at sweet spot, yeah, you're not going to really get enough stress there because you're not going hard enough, okay? So really I kind of need to put some parentheses in here in this box and say 30 minutes right here, whoops, and then that way, I would have that, correctly in there. But yeah, you need to do 30 minutes at least. When you can do a 2.5-hour sweet spot rod, you're doing something. Okay, you are really doing something, and that is a lot of work, and you should definitely be pretty psyched about your fitness at that point. And so keep that in mind. All right, great question. Great question. Good one there. All right. I do most of my training during the week on a trainer. How can those numbers be used when I move outside? Okay, so similar to the question we had earlier about how we use our numbers between both places. Well, first off, if you're doing indoor training, then you have to absolutely test indoors for indoors, and then you got to have outdoors. So you're going to have two sets of training zones. Okay, so I would highly recommend that you make sure you rest and do a very good indoor test so you have a good solid understanding of what your zones are indoors. And then I would make sure and do a little bit of rest and taper a little bit and do a really good outdoor test when you go outside on the weekend so that you know exactly what your zones are outdoors. So it's going to be a bit of a challenge. But at the same time, I also think that you're going to start to recognize that relationship between indoor and outdoor, and you'll know. Once you see it, you'll know where you are and how to handle that from that perspective. So I would just encourage you to do both, and then know at some certain point here, okay, well, I'm always about 15 watts difference outdoors or indoors, and I'll bet you indoors, you ride enough indoors, you're going to probably be very similar outdoors. You'll become trained, so to speak, indoors, and that'll be very similar to what you can do outdoors. So great question. All right, I find there's a large disparity between the FT test on the CompuTrainer versus the actual rod with power tap, with the power tap being higher. How should they be reconciled if training on both? Well, go with the power tap. The power tap is going to be way more accurate in terms of, all of your wattages, indoors, outdoors, on all the different models of indoor trainers as well. I love the CompuTrainer, but at the same time, it requires you to have a very accurate setup in terms of you need to have the right press-on force from the wheel. You need to make sure that you get the wheel, the tire hot, and then it needs to maintain that heat. And then after that, you've got to make sure that didn't drift through the rod. So the power tap's beautiful in that perspective. So something that I would just, whatever the power tap says, go for it. That's your number. Okay, that's absolutely your number. And then the CompuTrainer, if you can't, if you don't have a power tap that you're riding every day on the CompuTrainer, and which I would just ride it on the CompuTrainer every day, then you need to make sure that you're always super consistent with your setup on the CompuTrainer. You're always doing your coast down. You're always getting very close numbers for that press-on force. That's super important, and something that you think. So keep that in mind as you look through it. Great question. Great question. All right. Good questions, you guys. How often do you recommend retesting? I really want everybody to test every 6 weeks. Okay, so I like those 6-week tests because Most fitness changes occur in 8-week blocks. Sometimes they occur in 6-week blocks. Sometimes they occur in 10-week blocks. But generally, if you test around 6 weeks, you'll capture that fitness change. You don't ever really know where you are in the beginning or the end of the fitness change, but you'll capture that one. So I really, really like that 6-week testing block. It's just long enough that it gives you some time to get some hard training in between, and then it's also not too far away from potentially missing a fitness improvement and then not training correctly for the rest of it. So that's something that you have to keep that in mind. All right, the key here. Okay, next question. What about those of us who work full-time and have a family? How do you feel about mixed workouts, tempo, sweet spot, endurance, variable effort during the week in periodized blocks? There's nothing wrong with that. I think that's great. I think that you absolutely ought to do, I call them my kitchen sink workouts, where you do a bit of everything in there. For those of us, I mean, and I slowly put myself in that boat as well. I have to do a little bit of each. I do a little bit of sweet spot. In January and February, I spent most of my time riding at sweet spot, but then I was doing some cadence drills. I was also doing some short micro intervals, micro bursts, 15 seconds on, 15 seconds off, to work on my neuromuscular power. Then as soon as I got outside, I did a bunch of endurance riding on the weekends, and included a little bit of climbing at tempo, at some threshold, even did some threshold work, shorter threshold work. So I think that you got to throw a little bit of all that in there, and something like that is a key to keeping your fitness high throughout the whole year. Let's see, what else we got here? We got a couple of numbers here. What level or zone is considered sweet spot? Yeah, it's not really a level or zone. Dr. Coggin and I have been debating about this for years now, and I said, we need another zone here. It needs to be, in between 3 and 4, and it needs to be called sweet spot, and blah, blah. And, and he's like, no, we cannot have more than 7 training zones. 7 is a prime number. There must be only 7 training zones. And so we only have 7 training zones. But I think I finally won that battle, and we're going to come out with some new training zones that have that in there. I believe we're calling it level 4A, I think is what we're calling it now. I'll have to look back at our notes and we're working on. It's right in that upper range of tempo, lower range of threshold. So that's where it is. So right in there, upper 3, lower 4. All right, great questions, everybody. Great questions. I know it's calculated power, but what are your thoughts on following the PowerCal numbers? I think as long as you do some testing and can correlate that well with testing, then you should be pretty close. They do a great job of looking at those numbers and figuring that out. So you just have to kind of test every 8 weeks or so with it, and then reset it, recalibrate it to get your new fitness in there. What's the normal protocol for a road threshold test? For me, I really like a 20-minute warm-up. I do 3 fast pedaling intervals, pedal a minute hard fast, rest for a minute hard fast, rest for a minute hard fast, and then I go at it. I drill it for 20 minutes and push myself all the way through it. Your respiration rate's really high, your heart rate's through the roof there at your threshold heart rate generally. Don't start crazy hard, build up in the first 2 or 3 minutes, so you gotta build up to it, and then you're at your threshold, and then you hold it all the way. In the last couple of minutes, you push yourself even harder to kind of bring it up a little bit notch higher. That's it. That's about it. Just do your best. That's it. Any more ERG videos coming? Oh, that's great. We got some ERG video fans out there. For those of you who don't know, ergvideo.com is a great partner with Peaks Coaching Group, and we made a bunch of really cool videos last year that came out this fall and winter, and I know a lot of people have been following them. And we might just have some ERG videos coming out for next year, so look for maybe this fall, winter, see what we can come up with. All right, I think that's it for questions. Thank you so much. This has been a great session for you guys and for me. I appreciate your time, and I hope that everybody enjoyed all of this. And it's a great pleasure to do this for PowerTap, and you know, it makes a huge difference there in terms of you know, using your power meter. I mean, again, these guys have done an incredible job. They have their new smart Envy wheels. I mean, they are just insanely fast. They're really well built, and I really like the new G3 hub as well. That way we can, you know, pull that easy to replace the batteries. It just makes really good sense, and they even have a Bluetooth one as well. So these guys are doing a great job. They've been around for a long time. Just a little background, my first PowerTap was back in 1999, and it was one of the old gray ones that not too many people have ever seen, and so I've been a great fan with these guys for many years. They're coming to our camp next week. We've got 2 camps here in Bedford, Virginia, so hopefully you might want to join us one year, and we're demoing all kinds of wheels, and we'll have a lot of time, a lot of fun playing with PowerTaps next week. Look for our updates on both the PowerTap Facebook page and Peaks Coaching Group Facebook page. And again, thank you, PowerTap, for sponsoring this great webinar, and I'm glad to share this knowledge with you guys. And make it a great evening. Thanks a lot. Bye-bye.